This thing, bin it. This, a waste of space, mate. This, what, you're telling me you use mad milk as a... No, yeah, that's a pretty good secondary, to be honest. Okay, what about this piece of... Yeah, that's pretty good too. Turns out there are quite a few good weapons for Scout, but for this series, we have to be ruthless, and we have to select just one loadout to rule them all. I'm going to propose to you what I think is the ultimate, most reliable, all-rounder loadout for Scout, and then I'll try to justify to you my choice. The best way to think about this question is, what loadout would you pick if you could only choose one loadout to use forevermore? And for me, this would be my loadout. Beautiful, isn't it? Or maybe this. Or this one. No, okay, I'll stick with this one. But just before we start this video...
Something, this is just my opinion, please leave me alone, thanks.
This series is all about creating a discussion. There is no right or wrong answer. There may be some weapons that are possibly objectively better than others, but many are side grades, and for many it's just too close to call, and nearly always it's highly situational and down to personal preference. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to pop them all in caps, and maybe add a nice "re" at the beginning. So let's start with the official TF2 Scout tier list. I created this based on my own experience, as well as by taking a look at the opinions of other content creators and prominent TF2 players. For example, Banny, who made a tier list of every single weapon in the game. And I also asked for your opinions on Twitter. Now, of course, this list is somewhat subjective, and I wasn't sure about a couple of items, but let me know if you think I've got anything massively out of place. By looking at this, we can normally cull a good portion of the weapons straight away to make things easier as we try to pick our ultimate loadout for Scout. One general observation here, there are loads of great options for Scout, especially when it comes to his secondary and his melee weapon, which I kind of find odd because Scout probably relies on his melee the least, as he can always just walk away, reload and shoot people some more. Maybe that's in fact why they decided to make so many interesting options for Scout for the melee slot, which often becomes more of a utility than just raw damage output. Okay, so let's start by taking a look at the Scout's primary weapon, which is probably the easiest part of this puzzle. Nothing beats the scattergun. The scattergun might be one of the best weapons in the game due to its reliability, its sustain, and its burst damage potential. If you can hit your meat shot, you can achieve a whopping 100 damage 6 times with one clip. Of course, this doesn't normally happen in reality because it turns out people moving stuff and aiming's hard, but you know, you get the idea. I'm hoping you won't need too much convincing for this one, but let's go through some of the other options to see why scattergun tends to be considered the best choice. The two weapons that I think come closest to competing with stock are the Force of Nature and the Soda Popper, both really good primaries for Scout and with potential to provide even more devastating burst damage than stock itself, as well as both providing additional mobility options. But these sometimes lack sustain for longer drawn out fights with multiple opponents. It feels like they deal less consistent damage, even if this isn't necessarily the case, which we'll come to in a second, and constrain you to a more hit and run style of gameplay. Plus, the knockback on the Force of Nature can often act as a downside, making it hard to hit and do as much damage with that second shot, although of course it is great for getting environmental kills. As for the Soda Popper, well, this has always felt a little lackluster post the 2013 nerf. The additional jumps when fully charged will sometimes be useful and can give you the edge when dueling non-hit scan opponents, but as always it is situational, and the weapon still feels like it suffers from that lack of consistency and sustain we see in the Force of Nature. Plus, you do have to charge the thing, which if you're as bad a Scout as me, isn't always a guaranteed, and so at the start of the game, it's just literally a slightly worse version of the Force of Nature. Or is it though? Again, we'll come back to that in just a second. But wait one chuckle nut! The Soda Popper is banned in some competitive leagues, so it must be OP, right? Well, my understanding is that this is because it can feel like it's giving an unfair advantage to Scouts when playing against soldiers and demos, and in the right hands, it can become pretty powerful and frustrating to play against. But my gut feeling is that if it was suddenly to be unbanned, I'm pretty sure not every single Scout would be rushing to use it because it's just ridiculously OP, or anything like that. I was curious though about the DPS of the Force of Nature versus stock. From the last video on this channel, we found that the scattergun can do about 100 sustained DPS if you include the 1.43 second loading time, and about 200 DPS if you exclude that loading time. The Force of Nature, on the other hand, can pump out 226 damage in less than a second, with its attack interval being about 0.3 seconds, and this drops down to 130 DPS when you include the reload time. So interestingly, both the burst and sustained damage is better with the Force of Nature, but because of the way the gun works and the way it limits you to firing twice in quick succession and then reloading, and the way that it knocks back opponents so it's very difficult to achieve 2 juicy meat shots on the same opponent, in reality it feels like you can achieve more consistent damage with the stock. If you are a bot and hitting 100% of your pellets, then the Force of Nature might be the more powerful option. But because fights are scrappy and drawn out, having those 6 shots to play with is massively useful. On a side note, while looking into these stats, I also found that interestingly, while the Soda Popper does slightly less damage with 2 shots, as expected, it actually has a higher potential sustained DPS because of its shorter reload time of 1.13 seconds. I had no idea that the Soda Popper had a shorter reload time than the Force of Nature. I always assumed they were the same, but actually this has quite a big impact over time, and for me makes it much more difficult to decide which of the 2 weapons are better. Scout Secondary is probably the most difficult part of this puzzle. Let's take a look at our options then, and I'll try and go through some of these quite quickly. Bonk is probably the most situational weapon in the Scout's arsenal. Great against sentry nests and getting behind a strong enemy front line, but normally there are other ways to flank the enemies. Criticola can be great for ambushing and taking down single high value targets like heavy or medic, but it does leave you vulnerable and it's also slow to drink mid-fight, which leaves us with what I think is the only real contender to the pistols, in my opinion, and that is Mad Milk. Which is not only extremely powerful in combat, but has tons of utility, allowing you to of course reveal spies and extinguish flames. Based on my research, it seems there are many scout mains who use Mad Milk as their go-to secondary. At the end of the day, it will depend on your playstyle, and both the pistol and the Mad Milk are solid options for sure. But for me, it comes down to the fact that I think the pistol is just always useful. Whatever the scenario, you will always have that extra damage to fall back on, as well as it giving you that little bit of extra range for dealing with sentry guns or pestering snipers and what have you. Milk is pretty much always useful too, to be fair, but sometimes it feels like I make more use of my pistol throughout a game than the Mad Milk. Possibly this is just down to the fact that you have to take it out, throw it, wait for it to land, and it also has, of course, quite a long cooldown. With the pistol, it feels like I'm using that weapon pretty much in every other fight that I find myself in, whereas with the Mad Milk, it feels like something you occasionally get out when the time is right, but when used right can of course have a much bigger impact. Okay, so I may not have convinced you all here, but this leaves us with the 3 pistols, but which one do we choose? For a long time, I used stock, but now I'm absolutely a pretty boy pocket pistol convert. This thing is so good and I wish I discovered it sooner. Before I try to explain why I love this weapon so much, loosely speaking, the Winger has a much smaller clip but is more powerful. The pistol sits at the other end of the spectrum, having the most amount of shots and dealing slightly less damage, and the Pretty Boy pocket pistol sits in the middle of the two in terms of the clip size, but has a slightly increased fire rate. On top of this, the Winger of course makes you jump slightly higher, which is not the most exciting stat in the world in my opinion, and the Pretty Boy gives you a little bit of health on hit. This is the one stat that makes the Pretty Boy pocket pistol so good. 15% faster firing speed doesn't seem like much, but boy do you feel it. This thing feels like a machine gun. And remember, often the pistol is about finishing opponents off. It's about getting damage out as quickly as possible, and so that's why for me the pocket pistol feels so effective. The health you get back on hit is just the cherry on top, and honestly I think this weapon would still be viable even without that stat. As for the other 2 pistols, well, for me the 60% reduced clip size on the Winger feels pretty harsh. Maybe if you are a god with the pistol and you can hit every single one of your shots, you're able to get out more damage more quickly with those 5 shots, but I find that because I'm trying to track the enemy's movement with my cursor, some of my shots are hitting and some aren't. Personally I feel like that larger clip size is useful for me to secure those kills. The stock pistol is of course another great option, and some would argue the best secondary for Scout, but at the end of the day it just feels like for me personally I'm being the most effective when I'm using the Pretty Boy's pocket pistol, but I'd love to hear what you guys think in the comments below. The Boston Basher is the best melee weapon for Scout. Done. The moment you add a weapon that has perks but effectively no downside, if you're good enough with it, then that weapon is always going to be really good. And I think this same idea can be applied to any of the Scout's melee weapons that has simply reduced damage as its downside. In my experience, the Scout very rarely needs to use his melee weapon to actually deal damage, so often it's worth taking a hit to your damage output for the benefit of other perks. On the other hand, if that melee weapon makes you more vulnerable to a certain type of damage or reduces your health, that just means the weapon is off the table for me. Let's start from the B tier and work our way up again. Note though that I think that all of these are better options than stock, but not better than fish, obviously, that goes without saying, or ham, or pan by the way. The sun on a stick is a meme, but it's actually a pretty decent meme, and that is for one reason: it makes you burn less. If you are set alight and are on the run, you can whip out this to take reduced damage. Pretty situational, but quite a useful piece of utility for the Scout. The Sandman, I know it's undergone a whole lot of changes and nerfs, and I know that any range option is of course super useful, and this thing certainly used to be amazing, but now simply because it reduces the Scout's HP to 110, this weapon has become quite off-putting for me, and I get the feeling that that's kind of the consensus from the community as a whole. But now we're getting to the real juicy options. First of all, the Rap Assassin. Why is this good? Because as I mentioned before, nobody uses the Scout's melee to deal damage, and so nobody really cares when reduced damage is the downside. And so with the Rap Assassin, it feels like you're practically getting an extra range option for free, which is pretty darn good. The Atomizer is another one that has been through lots of changes. Based on my understanding, again, nobody really cares that this weapon does less damage. The Atomizer simply becomes a handy utility option for the Scout that you can whip out occasionally whenever you need some extra mobility. I think the Atomizer and the Rap Assassin are both awesome options for the Scout, but for this video I'm still choosing the Boston Basher, and the reason the Boston Basher is so good is twofold. One, it doesn't even do less damage, so it feels like you're getting the bleed perk for free, as long as you don't miss of course. And two, the downside is actually an upside, allowing the player to purposely take self damage and build an Uber with your medic. But I have to be fair here, this feature is mainly used in a competitive environment, and it's pretty rare to see this technique being used in a casual game of TF2. So there's a good argument for the Atomizer or Rap Assassin being the best melee weapon for Scout. But if I had to choose one melee weapon for the rest of time, it would have to be the Boston Basher. So there we have it. What do you think of this majestical loadout? Is it the greatest thing you've ever seen? Have I changed your perspective on reality? Or are you wondering who this idiot boomer is, who doesn't even play Scout and doesn't even know what he's talking about? Please don't answer that. I always learn a lot when making these videos, and it makes me rediscover weapons I should really be trying more often. And I always find it interesting to see which classes have the most viable side grades and variety available to them. Oh, and here's a new thing I'm doing. This gets a 1 out of 3 stockness rating, maybe a 1.5 or a 2 because the pistol's so good. And this also gets a versatility rating of, because there are just tons of great secondary and melee options available to the Scout. This loadout I chose for Scout is kind of heavily influenced by the meta in competitive sixes. It would be interesting to see what weapons are more suited to different game modes and different maps. At the end of the day though, I encourage you all to mix it up. That's why we have 4 loadout slots in the first place. Trying new weapons and classes can really freshen this game up. But this series is good fun to kind of spark a discussion. And at the same time, it's always good to have your go-to loadout. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know what you think I've got wrong. Thanks for watching. A special thank you to all my Patreons. I hope you had a great Christmas. I hope you're having a great 2021. And I'll see you guys in the next one.